So the last presidential debate is this Thursday. If you watch the debate, you watch most of it or as much as you can handle, and you write something up, you can get extra credit for that. They did announce that they will be muting the microphone of the candidate whose turn it is not to speak, so hopefully it'll be a little bit more civilized. So if you write up something about the debate, you can get extra credit. You can only get up to 6 points of extra credit in this class. If you've already done the first 3 debate/town halls, you won't get extra credit for this one. If you haven't, then you can get extra credit. Any questions on that? Everyone's good? Okay. So we're going to finish our discussion on elections today. We're going to talk about recent election history, issues with elections, and end by discussing the Electoral College. Before I start on the lecture, I did want to show you an example of a 527 ad. It's an ad run by a political action committee rather than a candidate. So this ad was recently released by an interest group, and it's interesting for a couple of reasons. So I wanted to share it all with you.
Imagine a young girl searching for a their hope that one day she will find friends. I imagine how she feels when she watches with
You ask a lot of specific questions.
Milan.
The monster that was on stage with Mike Pence, who destroyed her last night, by the way.
I think
That's okay.
I'm sorry? Harassed.
What's coming out of her?
Daughters are listening and observing that message right in front of your eyes. I'm imagining a different for her. Picturing a president who doesn't just ballot, chooses one to be his and woman. A strong woman. A woman with passion. Woman afraid to take. And I want to ask if Mr. Vice President speak. Imagine that little girl in the mirror, because that little girl is yours, and your actions are define who she sees. Vote for change. Vote for her. The Voting Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
All right, so see at the bottom where it says not authorized. So that was interesting. A couple reasons. One, it's kind of getting down into vote for the future of your kid. And two, the Lincoln Project typically endorses Republican candidates. So for them to actually be endorsing the Democratic candidate, that's pretty rare. You don't usually see groups crossing party lines, but they did here. They've actually chosen to endorse Biden rather than Trump. So it's a rare example of the Political Action Committee actually switching sides in a presidential election. So it's very interesting to see that they've decided to switch sides for this election. What do you think? Was it a fairly powerful ad, or was it just kind of Yeah. Pretty straightforward. Yeah. Okay. So we had talked last time about primaries, general elections, campaign staff. Now we get to the behemoth that is money, right? Money is what makes elections possible. You're going to have to raise millions of dollars. You have to fund your ads. You have to fund polling. You have to fund your campaign staff. A direct mailing campaign in one city can cost at least $1 million to get the mailing lists, to print it, and to pay for postage. So you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars if you're running for president. Now there are restrictions on how much we can give as individuals. We can only donate $2,700 every 2 years to a candidate. There is a maximum amount we donate. However, there are no limits on how many candidates you can donate to. So if you're a millionaire, you could donate to 100,000 candidates. And usually, candidates, especially for president, will rely on political action committees. So they are the biggest fundraisers for candidates. And they'll represent corporations. They'll represent unions, firefighters, police officers, electricians, and so on. For most candidates, this is where the money really comes in. It's extremely rare for a candidate to not accept PAC money. The one real exception to this rule has been Bernie Sanders. In 2016, Bernie Sanders raised $1 billion through individual contributions, $850 million of which came from people donating $20, $30, $50. So it can be done, but you have to have the grassroots level support for that to happen. For most candidates, we're going to go straight to the political action committees to get them to do the fundraising for them. There's a little over 4,600 PACs that are registered with the Federal Election Commission. They do have to register so we know what are they raising money for, where are they spending the money, and who's donating it. There is some transparency in that sense. And they're the ones who run the 527 ads, the ads that may be for or against a candidate, but aren't released by the candidate themselves. There's also what's called a 501c4. These are politically active non-profits. As long as their goal is not to fundraise, then the money is considered dark money. So for these PACs, they're not required to disclose who's donating the money, how much they donate, what's being done with it. If you could create a 501c4 and say the point of this is to increase voter registration, and as long as that was all you were focusing on, then you could spend as much money as you want, and you don't have to say where it's coming from. This is called dark money, and this is some of the money that we don't get to know where it's being spent on an election. We know where a lot of the money is coming from, but we don't know where all of it is coming from. So if you are donating to a candidate, You are required to put in your name and your occupation. They're going to know where the money's coming from. Is it coming from teachers? Is it coming from lawyers? Who's making the contributions? Okay, now on the presidential level, there is public funding available. Public funding is available for candidates who will raise at least $5,000 for contributions of $250 or less. The money that is available in terms of public funding comes from our tax dollars. When you file your tax return, you'll see a box that gives you the chance to donate $2 if you're an individual or up to $6 from your tax return to the presidential campaign fund. So because it is publicly funded, there are restrictions on how much money they can spend. So if a candidate accepts the matching funds, they cannot spend more than $48.7 million total in the presidential election. And again, public funding is only available for presidential candidates, not any other race. Candidates don't usually accept matching funds. And that's because if you don't take public funding, there's no restriction on how much money you can spend. In 2008, John McCain accepted the matching funds. He couldn't spend more than $48 million. Barack Obama didn't accept the matching funds. He could spend something like $500, $600 million. Clearly, the candidate who would accept matching funds is at a significant disadvantage. They can't spend as much. They can't match the campaign strategy. For most candidates, it's in their best interest not to accept the matching funds. They don't want to get it outspent 10 or 15 times by their opponent. There's also no restriction on how much money candidates can spend on their own campaign unless they accept matching funds. If they do accept the matching funds, they can only spend $50,000 of their own money. If they don't, they can spend as much as they have. Ross Perot, as he was a third-party candidate, a billionaire, he spent basically millions of his own money. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton did the same thing in 2016. Sometimes candidates run short of money, especially towards the end of the election cycle. There's a fatigue that kicks in. People stop donating. If they're reaching the finish line and they don't have the money, they use their own money to kind of try to cross the finish line. It's not uncommon for a candidate to spend their own money to launch their campaign and to finish it if we hit that donor fatigue status. We're not seeing it as much here, but it's not uncommon. So how do voters decide, right? How do they determine which way they're going to vote? Usually it is along party lines. Town ticket races like state judiciary, city council, board tend to be partisan. There's not as much information about the candidates. You don't necessarily know who they are. You're going to vote Democrat or Republican, occasionally Libertarian. There's also sometimes a focus on policy. Sometimes you really want a candidate whose views reflect your own. If you're someone who is very strongly pro-life, then you want a candidate who's pro-life. If you're someone who thinks the government needs to fix our healthcare system, bring back a candidate who's about universal healthcare, Medicare for all. And there's two different types of voting we tend to see. Prospective voting is where you're voting based on what you think the candidate will do. So this is common when there's no incumbent. What do you think Hillary Clinton is going to do versus Donald Trump? In 2008, Barack Obama was focusing on the need for change, right? Hope and change, yes we can. The voters go in on election day and say, what do I think Donald Trump would do in office? What do I think Joe Biden would do in office? So they vote based on what they think their candidate will do. Retrospective voting is common when there is an incumbent. Look at how the candidate has done. They talk about the need to stay the course. To keep me in office, I'll keep working on these policies, right? You're looking at what they've done and you're saying, am I happy with the job President Trump has done? Yes. You vote for him. No. You vote the other way. In elections where there is an incumbent, you tend to see voters thinking, what will they do when they're in office? Where there is an incumbent, it becomes, what have they done in office? And am I happy with the work that they've done? There's also how well our economy is doing. When the economy is doing well, the party in power tends to stay in power. When it's not, they tend to get voted out. In 2008, with the collapse of the economy, voters blamed Republicans and kicked them out of office. Whether or not that will happen this election, we don't know. Right? The economy was doing pretty well until the pandemic hit. People are worried about the state of the economy. They're worried if they can keep their business open, if they're still going to have a job. That may influence how people vote. They may choose to say, we haven't been happy with how the government has handled the pandemic, so we're going to vote the other way. Sometimes it just comes down to their characteristics. Does their voice annoy you? I mean, that's superficial, but it does happen, right? Religion, race, social background, gender. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that Kamala Harris is running mate? We don't know, right? It could be good, it could be bad. Did the Democrats make a mistake nominating Hillary Clinton in 2016? Hard to tell, right? Because there were some people who aren't yet on board with the idea of a female president. We also get questions of, are they conservative? Are they liberal? Do they grow up poor like me, or have they always had an advantage? Sometimes it's just, I don't like this guy, or I don't like this woman. And that's how people decide. It's not a very rational choice at the end of the day. Sometimes it just comes down to, they both suck, but this one I can tolerate. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who's a Republican, and he said that he likes Joe Biden, but Kamala Harris gets him ahead for some reason. And I'm like, I mean, okay, I don't quite see that, but okay, that's fine. I can understand why maybe you don't like her. That's fine. Gives me a headache. Okay, I mean that's fair. All right. Yeah, I know. We have to talk about it. I'm sorry. This is when I want to bring a bottle of tequila to class for you guys. This was not a pretty election, right? On the Democratic side, there are technically three candidates: Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley. Martin O'Malley was pretty much eliminated from the beginning because the media decided he didn't matter. In the primaries, Hillary Clinton had the support of the older, more established voters. Bernie Sanders enjoyed huge support amongst young voters. He won more votes of people under 30 than Clinton and Trump combined. That's exceedingly rare. He wasn't the nominee. Why was that? Well, one, young people don't show up to vote in as large numbers as older voters. They liked him, but that didn't translate into showing up on election day. And two, there was some party leadership bias. The head of the DNC, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, really wasn't impartial. I mean, she made it pretty clear she was backing Hillary Clinton from the very beginning. Donna Brazile, who was part of the Democratic National Committee, actually gave some of the debate questions to Hillary Clinton ahead of a debate. That's a big no-no. They're not supposed to choose the candidate, right? They're supposed to sit on the sideline. Clinton didn't have enough delegates to ensure her nomination until 6 weeks before the convention. She largely got it because of the superdelegates. So the Democratic Party was fractured because you had Bernie Sanders supporters who said she cheated, so how can we vote for her? And then you had Clinton people who said, shut up and get on board, right? It wasn't a pretty experience. So part of the problem on the Democratic side was not enough candidates running and party bias. On the Republican side, there were way too many people running. There were 17 candidates at the beginning. And all that does is fracture the vote. I mean, Trump won more votes than his opponents in the primaries. He also had more votes against him than any candidate in history. He was not universally popular within the party. He was basically the guy who crossed the finish line because the vote was so fractured that he ended up being the last man standing. He's also the first major party candidate since 1940 with no political or military experience. The only other president in modern history who had never served in political office was President Eisenhower. But he had been in the military. And you do get a lot of political experience as a military general, especially during a world war. So he was able to negotiate. Trump, because he didn't have either of those experiences, you could tell that he stumbled a bit when he first got into office. Had trouble really understanding how to play the political game. Both candidates ended up being divisive in their party. Some Democrats were ticked off with the bias towards Hillary Clinton, and there were party elites who said, I'm not endorsing Donald Trump. I don't like him. I don't agree with him. I'm staying away from him. Usually, the candidates who ran and then lost will endorse the party's candidate. There were a lot of Republicans who refused to do that. John Kasich absolutely refused to endorse Trump. So it wasn't pretty on either side. There's a lot of ugliness and infighting in both parties. It was funny because my alma mater, Western Illinois University, does a mock election every 4 years. And they had been right every single election until they got to 2016. Because college students said Bernie Sanders was going to be the nominee, he was going to win. It was the only time in history they got it wrong. You gotta laugh at that a little bit, right? Because it's like young people clearly went for Bernie Sanders. They couldn't get the older voters on board. So they might have had it right if the older voters had chosen Bernie Sanders. Okay. Also didn't know that these were the two most disliked candidates in modern history. only knew a handful of people who were actually enthusiastic of Hillary Clinton. Most of them were, well, we don't like Trump, so I guess we'll vote for her. Neither candidate really well loved in their party. There were a lot of issues that just caused so many problems for the voters. With Trump, the allegations of sexual assault, complaints about rape, the infamous comment, grab them by the, you know what, right? Not exactly presidential. Hillary Clinton, part of the problem was the use of a private email server as Secretary of State. She was not the first Secretary of State to do so. Colin Powell also used a private email server. The problem is, the State Department needs to know you're doing that, and you have to make sure it's encrypted enough that nobody could hack in and get access to your emails. Her server may not have been secure enough. So there's a lot of questions about that. There were also issues with her role as Secretary of State when our embassy was attacked in Benghazi, Libya in 2011. One of our ambassadors was killed in the attack, and there were questions about whether or not the State Department had done enough to try and protect the embassy. She ended up having to testify before Congress, answer questions about her role in it. It came up repeatedly in the election. With Trump, there was also the question about his tax returns. We do have access to some of that information now, finding out that he only paid about $750 in taxes 1 year. Questions about his manipulation of his Trump properties to fund his election. We don't have all of that information, but in 2015, he broke tradition and said, I'm not releasing my tax returns. Now, they're not required by law to do so. Traditionally, candidates do so in the name of transparency. So his refusal to do so led people to say, what are you hiding, right? What aren't you telling us? And then sometimes we get what's called an October surprise. Sometimes something momentous will happen a few weeks, a few days, beginning of the month, and shift the outcome of the election. 11 days before the election, the FBI reopened its investigation into the Clinton emails. This is a little complicated. Hillary Clinton had an advisor, Huma Abedin, who had been married to Congressman Anthony Weiner. Weiner had been busted for sexting underage girls and ended up in jail. At one point, a married couple was sharing a laptop, and so they were looking into private emails that only someone should have had access to. Did her husband have access to that email? They reopened the investigation, and they found out that no, he did not. The FBI was damned if they did and damned if they didn't. They didn't reopen the investigation, and she wins, and they find out she broke the law. That's a problem. They reopened the investigation, think she's committed a crime, possibly, confuse the election. They really didn't have much of a choice. It wasn't great time, but there's not much you can do about that. Right. So, what happened in 2016? We had 59% vote out, a little bit lower compared to 2012 and 2008. But not surprising given that people didn't like the candidates. A lot of people chose to stay home on election day. The voter turnout was only 50%. Again, they didn't like the candidates. Hillary Clinton wasn't speaking to young Democrats about their issues. Some young Republicans weren't on board with Trump, so they stayed home on election day. In terms of the numbers, Trump did get 90% of the registered Republicans' votes. They may not have liked him, but they did vote for him. There was some speculation that maybe they crossed party lines, but that didn't happen. He also got 81% of the evangelical vote, largely because he brought Mike Pence on as his VP. Evangelicals were lukewarm about Trump, but bringing on Mike Pence helped get them in line. He got 81% of the conservative vote and 67% of whites with no college degree. Clinton, on the other hand, got 71% of non-white college graduates, 54% of the women's vote, and 75% of non-whites without a college degree. What exactly happened? There were two questions that came to mind. Do we stay the course and vote for someone with experience, or do we want radical change? So, among the voters who wanted change, 83% of them voted for Donald Trump. Voters who wanted a candidate with experience, 90% of them voted for Hillary Clinton. At the end of the day, people wanted a change. They were tired of politics as usual. They were tired of Washington insiders. They looked at Hillary Clinton and they said, we don't want a dynasty. Her husband served 2 terms. Why do we want her in office? The voters said, let's give Trump a chance. He's an outsider. He doesn't have ties to Washington. What the hell, right? Let's give him a chance. And it also played out in the primaries because Jeb Bush ran, and people looked at that and said, we do not want a 3rd member of the Bush family in the White House. Get out of here. It is unfortunate because he's actually a lot smarter than his brother was, but voters weren't exactly interested in another Bush presidency. So the polls kept saying Hillary Clinton was going to win, right? We kept seeing that over and over again. Hillary Clinton's going to win. Hillary Clinton's going to win. So what exactly went wrong? Well, the economy had turned around. It was certainly in a lot better shape compared to 2008. But there were concerns among blue-collar workers about their jobs being outsourced. Concerns about possibly the loss of mining jobs. Hillary Clinton talking about moving away from coal for people who do work in the mines in Kentucky and other states. So there was a fair amount of insecurity amongst low-income Americans about the economy. And that kind of shifted their views. Polls also didn't include enough non-college educated whites, independents, or first-time voters. Also, to be quite blunt, people lied in the polls. It wasn't seen as socially acceptable to say you were voting for Donald Trump, so people lied. They lied, and they said, I don't know, or I'm voting for Hillary Clinton, when they actually weren't. So they weren't asking the right questions. They weren't asking the right people. There's also more straight ticket voting. Republicans may not have liked Donald Trump, but they did like their representatives and their senators. Straight ticket voted. Basically held their nose and voted for Trump so that they could get Cornyn and they could get others elected. Not Cornyn, because that's re-election this year, but they could get Republicans in control, right? So Republicans did not cross party lines. They may not have liked Trump, but they weren't going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And they didn't stay home on election day. They came out to support the down-ticket races. And the other problem, this cannot be emphasized enough, is that for some weird reason they kept overestimating female support for Clinton. There was this weird, persistent belief that women would vote for Clinton because she was a woman, which I don't think I've rolled my eyes harder than when I heard. You cannot, under any circumstances, assume that women are a monolithic group and will vote for a woman because she's a woman. That's insulting, right? That's just insulting to women. The female Republicans did not cross party lines. They did vote for her. There were plenty of women who said, yeah, I want a female president, but I don't want. She was not that well liked. And the assumption that women would vote for a woman because she's a woman is fundamentally flawed. It makes no logical sense to believe that that's the case. It didn't help during the primaries when former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright told Democratic women who voted for Sanders and said there's a special place in hell for women who don't support each other. Basically saying that Sanders supporters were bad feminists. That did not go over well. There were a lot of women who said, don't you dare tell me how to vote. Right? Don't you dare tell me I'm a feminist because I'm not supporting female candidates. So they were off on so much within the polls. They were wrong on so much. And there was a lot that they just didn't understand about how the voters were feeling. Which is why I'm a little hesitant to trust the polls this time around as well. I think there are Trump supporters out there who are kind of keeping quiet right now. So I don't quite trust what the polls are saying. I'm a little hesitant to believe them at face value. It was significant that we did have the first female candidate for a major party. We've only had 3 instances in history where a woman was the VP candidate. 1984 with Geraldine Ferraro, 2008 with Sarah Palin, and then this year with Kamala Harris. So it was important historically that she was the nominee, but I don't think the country is quite ready for a female president yet. We're still getting there. Right, so post 2016, right, President Trump has been able to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices so far. He's about to nominate a third. Because there was the death of Scalia that should have been filled by Garland, but was filled by Gorsuch, and the retirement of Judge Kennedy, where he was replaced by Brett Kavanaugh, another death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and a possible replacement by Amy Coney Barrett. It's extremely rare for a president in the first term to get 1 Supreme Court opening, let alone 3. So this is pretty monumental. There have also been attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. It's largely failed because Republicans have been told by the constituents, don't get rid of my health care until you come up with a better plan. Because the Republicans have not proposed a better plan than the Affordable Care Act, the constituents have said to them, don't dump me back a broken healthcare market, right? Don't get rid of my insurance. Some Republicans have said, we don't have a plan, and we certainly don't have a better plan, so we need to just leave it alone. It's not perfect. We'll have access to healthcare, right? So we're not going to take that away from them. We've also seen, of course, the construction of the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, which is problematic in terms of cost. efficiency and issues with trying to build a wall through people's backyards, through endangered wildlife sanctuaries. And my particular favorite, the destruction of indigenous American burial grounds to build the wall. Because, through them, right? That really gets my blood going. It's just unbelievable. Yeah, it's like, really, you can't just give them their fucking cemetery, like, come on. Anyway. Okay. Within the Democratic Party, right, we've seen some issues between progressives and moderates. The moderates have won this round. Now, it's going to depend on what happens on election day. If Biden loses, the party progressives may have the ability to say, look, we moved to the middle, it didn't work, so stop ignoring us. But they're still kind of going back and forth on that. There's also anger about the fact that the winner of the popular vote was president. People tend to forget about the Electoral College until there is an issue. So people were looking at that and going, why isn't Hillary Clinton president? Well, that's the Electoral College, right? Also issues with false news stories. Facebook is trying to do a better job of cutting down on that. There's just so much false information out there that they're not going to be able to catch everything. There's false stories like Hillary Clinton had cancer when she collapsed at the 9/11 memorial. No, it was 100 degrees and she had pneumonia, right? There's a difference. Or the gate. Or all sorts of weird information out there. And the reality is that money does still have a great influence, right? We have a man who claims to be a billionaire, may or may not be, but is definitely very wealthy. The majority of Congress is made up of millionaires. That has not changed. There's a lot to talk about draining the swamp. I haven't seen it, to be honest. I haven't seen a lot of the change that people really wanted post-election. Okay, so the most recent election was 2018, right? So we don't know what's going to happen in a little over 2 weeks. 2018, there was a bit of a blue wave in that Democrats were able to take control of the House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House again. It did not extend to the Senate. Republicans were able to hold on and gain seats in the Senate, although in a couple of those races it was really weird. The Senate race in Florida, for example, there was some irregularities with ballots. That was a little bit funky. So Democrats have control of the House, Republicans have control of the Senate, so we have a divided Congress, which is why they're not getting anything done. One of the positive things is that we do have the highest number of women in Congress in history. And we have the highest number of female candidates running for office. And we're seeing women running again this year as well. They've been encouraged by the fact that women did win office in 2018. So they're hoping to gain even more seats in the House and the Senate. We also saw the highest midterm election turnout since 1966 at about 47–48%. Keep in mind, midterm election turnouts usually closer to 38–39. It was important in a lot of ways because people were encouraged to show up. They weren't happy with what they saw in 2016, so they came out for midterm elections. We saw a lot more participation. There were also ballot initiatives in different states on things like the death penalty. California had put forward a referendum to ban the death penalty. It failed, but the current Congress basically said no one will be executed while I'm in office. Also, California hasn't executed anyone on death row since like the early 90s, so it's kind of a moot point. Some areas did increase the minimum wage. Los Angeles County, it's $15 an hour because you can't live there on less than that. With marijuana, Massachusetts legalized recreational marijuana. Michigan legalized medicinal marijuana. So we are seeing more states expanding legalization of marijuana in some form or another. In Florida, they also voted to restore voting rights to felons who have completed their probationary/parole period. Some initiatives that were fairly important that did get voters out to the polls. You may not care who your House representative is, but you may care about the minimum wage or marijuana or voting rights. There was higher turnout than usual, which was a good sign. Whether or not that's going to happen this year, it's unclear. But Texas has actually had the most people early voting so far. We've had about 4 million Texans already early voting. The voting's been open only for about a week. So that's pretty huge that we've already had 4 million Texans voting early. I went ahead and voted on Friday because I was like, I don't have time to wait in line on election day. In some places there's a line. I didn't have a line, but my parents' sister had to wait an hour and a half in San Antonio. But in some places they're talking 5, 6, 11 hours to early vote. So people are feeling motivated to vote this time around. What that will mean in the end is still up in the air, but it is significant. It's also significant, the Supreme Court was asked to handle a case where the governor of Pennsylvania said, we will count ballots that arrive 3 days after the election in the mail. The Republican Party within Pennsylvania didn't want that. The Supreme Court deadlocked. And so basically they've said, look, we're going to count the ballots even if they show up a couple of days after the election, because there are going to be people at the post office, there's going to be delays in getting them counted. We're not going to tell people that, oops, your ballot showed up late, it's not going to be. So that's significant as well. It likely means in some states we won't know who won that state till 3-4 days after the election. So I would be very, very surprised if we actually know who won on election night. I think that's not likely to happen. Okay, so since we have a little time, I did want to talk about the Electoral College a little bit more and see if this way a little bit. Okay. All right. So in the Electoral College, there are 538. Electoral College votes, okay? So out of 538, candidate needs to get 270 to win. I can't see that, but okay. What happens if there's a tie? Right? What happens if neither candidate gets the 270? Let's say hypothetically you get 269 for Biden and 269 for Trump. What happens in that set of circumstances? If there is a tie in the Electoral College, it does not go to the popular vote. It goes to Congress. And Congress, the House of Representatives, chooses the president, the Senate chooses the vice president. So even if there is a tie in the Electoral College, our vote doesn't decide who's president. Like, it's up to Congress at that point to decide. Okay, so let me. Okay. Does this seem like a city Congress? Does that seem fair? Okay. Okay. So it doesn't seem right. If you think about it, it also doesn't make a lot of sense to allow basically less than 1% of the population to choose the president for a country of over 300 million. So there's been a bit of discussion about should we abolish the Electoral College. Well, there's two sides to that, of course. The pros are that the winner of the popular vote would then be the president, right? Then we'd eliminate the whole you're not actually elected by the people. The downside to that is you could still have a president who's elected by less than 51% of the vote, right? They could win 43% of the vote and still be president. Also, it does make it complicated in the area of how do we keep an election intact? Right? If we went to a straight popular vote, how do we make sure someone doesn't really try to tamper with our election in that way? So there's pros and cons on both sides of this. That's my question for you guys. Do you think we should get rid of the Electoral College and just make it a straight popular vote? Sure.
So, yes, but there should be
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the positive side is it would encourage people to vote, right? Because then you are directly electing the president and people would be more likely to show up to vote. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the argument you can make for the Electoral College is that generally it does work. Right? You've only had 4 or 5 elections where the winner of the popular vote is not the president. So it's actually not terrible, right? It does usually work. The fact that we've had 2 in 16 years is, I think, what trips people, right? We've had 2 elections in 16 years. I think it's a little tricky. Yeah. I mean, the other suggestion that's been made is tie the electoral college to the popular vote, where the electors have to vote the way the population did, which isn't a terrible idea. Some states have gone to that, so you can't go rogue the other way. You could do electoral college split, right? Like in 2016, Donald Trump didn't win the majority of the vote in Florida, so maybe he shouldn't have gotten all 29 delegates. Maybe he should have gotten half, right? Maybe it's a little bit more equitable. The reason the electoral college largely exists is because the small states understand that in a popular vote election, nobody would spend any time in Wyoming or Nevada or Delaware, right? For the electoral college, you have to get the 270 somehow, so you are going to spend some time in those states. The counter argument is, well, nobody lives in these states, so why should their vote count for more? And two, if you've only got 3 electoral votes and California has 55, where's the candidate going? California, right? They're not going to your state anyway. They're not spending time there anyway. So you can go both ways on that. You can go both ways on that. Any predictions on who you think's going to win? Trump, he could win re-election. Yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
Like a lot of people say, oh, you know what Trump is doing.
Yeah, Trump is a known factor, Biden is not.
Even though I'm just like, you know what he's capable of and what he's like.
People may be like, he's not the most articulate president, but I agree with his policy, so I can overlook that. Or you might say, I mean, I don't love him, but I don't like that other guy. So, yeah. 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 I mean, I think it's an interesting sign that people are early voting. They don't tend to early vote if they're voting for the incumbent. But that doesn't mean anything this time around the pandemic, right? So that's not necessarily a sign one way or the other. I think it's going to depend on how people are feeling about the economy. It's not in great shape. It could be worse, right? So the question can become, is the economy going to get better or worse? And do we like the way President Trump has handled the pandemic? And I think those 2 questions are going to decide how people vote. And it's going to be a very interesting election. There's only been a handful of elections that were held during a time of crisis. Civil War, of course. World War I, not really, because we weren't in the war yet. World War II, the Great Depression. Those are the last couple of times we voted during a major crisis, and the 2008 economic recession. It's rare to have an election where so many complicated things are happening, and that it's really scary in some ways. It's been a while since we've had that kind of election. So, I think it's going to be close. I think it's going to depend on who shows up on election night. Democrats feel enough surge of energy to show up, and Biden could win. If they're just kind of like, whatever, then I think Trump can win. If independents stay home on election day, well, who the hell knows? Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay. So Thursday we're going to talk about interest groups in all their splendid glory. So read chapter 11 for Thursday. And again, if you do watch the debate on Thursday night and you write something up about it, that will count for extra credit. Okay. If you have any questions between now and Thursday, you can email me or call or text my cell phone. Enjoy the rest of your day.